Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back. This is the 10th lecture of the series, from which, as in previous lecture, as I said, that we are now gradually moving towards the more practical implementation of analysis of public policy. So far we have gone through the theory only, and now we are moving towards the basis of an analysis. Some of the quantitative stuff that we already studied, we will go through some of the qualitative stuff, and in the coming lectures we will go through a practical example of an attempt at reform that was carried out a few years ago. The last attempt, or the original one, wasn't so successful, so they built upon that research, they built upon that initiative, pointed out the shortcomings, what we learned in incrementalism, instead of just finishing off with the project and saying that it doesn't work. They analyzed it, they saw, or they came up with recommendations of what the shortcomings were, and then proceeded with some new initiatives, some new design parameters, and a better way of going about things. We'll study that in the coming lectures, but for the moment what we are going to do in these coming 1 or 2 lectures is just to finish up on all this theoretical basis of what we have been studying till now. Now mind you, these were a lot of lectures built around theory, and the reason that I went through all this stuff for at least, even now we are going to cover some of the theoretical stuff. In the last lecture, if you remember, we covered some of graphical stuff to tried to go through the simple demand and supply analysis. The reason that I am going through all this stuff, and slowly but gradually, is that you need a good grounding in understanding this stuff. Yes, you can draw pictures, you might be able to run tests, which I hope you would be, quantitative tests, once you take the statistics class or econometrics classes. And if some of you have already taken it, you'd recognize that it's fine. You can run a few programs, you can design a few programs, you can graph a few things, you can graphically analyze a public policy too, which we will do, which we'll definitely do. There is quite a bit of graphical portion over here too. But before we go on, you need a good grounding of what we are doing. Last time when I went over the basic demand and supply stuff, you would have noticed something, except for those of you who have read economics. Those who haven't read economics may find it a bit difficult, may find it a bit challenging, but that is what I am trying to do, make it easier for you. So I'll be going through the very basic steps of constructing those diagrams, constructing those graphical analysis, and or the other whatever we do in terms of public policy analysis, quantitative, qualitative. As I said, we'll go through an example, and you would see one of the implications or one of the applications of the qualitative methodology, and how they go about it in real world. But for the moment now, we'd be just finishing up on the stuff that is mostly theoretical and just leading towards the more practical implementation of stuff. So let's get started with this lecture. As always, first of all, just a bit of a brief summary of what we went through in the last lecture. We went through some of the quantitative methods for use in public policy analysis. I discussed only some of them. Then I also suggested that if you have to become a good public policy analyst, let's say the word most probably is credible one. You need some background in this stuff. You would want to run some of the equations, run some of the tests, you would want to learn this stuff, because it gives you credibility in today's world. If you are a public, it's fine that you can draw graphs and conclude something, which is good enough, it's not bad, but to add further credibility, and what a lot of people now, especially the employers, what they seek is that the person is somehow maybe not a master at quantitative methodologies, the econometric and that sort of stuff, but at least he knows the basic stuff and he can run a few regressions or things like that. So in the last lecture, when we went through some of those quantitative methods, I just gave you the basic grounding or the basics of some of the tests we go through, and which are pretty common, and some of them are regression analysis. I think that this one is the most common one. I don't do a lot of this stuff. We learned it in our when I was finishing up my course, during the course of my studies. We used to do that a lot, but after that, in professional life, I didn't get the chance to practice much of it. But this is worth going through, and this is worth learning. Some of those methodologies: regression analysis, time series analysis, event history analysis, factor analysis, path analysis. These all relate to econometrics and statistics. So again, if you can get your, in fact, there are quite a few books for those of you who haven't had a basic theory in economics or statistics. There are quite a few good books available in the store, so you can get hold of them. You can get hold of them from any old book bank, or you can buy a used one, just for your understanding, of what some of the basic stuff like mean, median, mode, mean, and what their implication is. Then introduction to simple demand and supply basics. I didn't go through all of it. I wanted to cover much more of it, but for the paucity of time, I couldn't do it. But we will be covering up on this stuff in quite a few lectures. It's going to take a few lectures to cover all this, because I will be going through every single step, in trying to teach you, in trying to make you understand how this graphical analysis works, and most of it is related to economics. So for people who already have taken economics, it should be easier. It shouldn't be a problem. It shouldn't be a lot of problem. But for those who haven't taken economics, you don't need to worry, because I'm going to be going through all the basics, which would make it easier for you to understand. So this is what we covered in the previous lecture. So let's move on towards today's lecture and what it is all about. Time to discuss qualitative methods of research. Last time we discussed the quantitative methods. Now this is now let's go to qualitative methods of research. And while quantitative methods veer towards testing complexity, qualitative methods are comparatively easier to implement. They revolve around theory construction. They are also known as interpretive methods. First of all, they were during 1960s when they were initially thought of, these qualitative methodologies, 50s and 60s, when they came around and got to be used extensively in many fields. They were just known as qualitative methods of research, but now they are also known as interpretive methods of research. What you are doing over here with these is, what the researcher in fact is doing is that he conducts a qualitative survey. Survey is an example of qualitative methods of research, and then tries to make an interpretation of it, of all the numbers, make sense of what he observed, what he surveyed, what the numbers say, without running any regressions, without running any complex theorems or complex programs, computer programs. So it's a lot about interpretation too. So not surprisingly, it's nowadays it's also called the interpretive methods. First at interviews, observations at a certain time, field research surveys, on-the-spot surveys. These are some of the qualitative methods. I'm sure you would have heard a lot of it. every second day, every week. In fact, if you watch a bit of news, I don't watch a lot of it because it's boring. It's the same stuff all around, but every day, day in and day out. But anyway, if you do get to watch the news, I do sometimes, you get these kind of surveys that this party is this much in popularity and its popularity has jumped by this much, this percentage, or it has come down by this percentage. This is an example of the qualitative methods of research and what it is about. Of course, it's not airtight. A lot of the times there are problems too. Predictions don't go that well. Recently in 2012 in the US presidential elections, there was a prediction that the Republican candidate Mitt Romney would be winning anywhere about 48%, 45 to 48% of vote. What they were predicting is that there would be a close contest between Barack Obama and his challenger. That is what the surveys at least said, but turned out when the results came in that Barack Obama won a landslide, and his challenger didn't even garner half of the vote that he had. So you can make an interpretation of it. You can just do a survey and say that this is what I have found. But the problem, not exactly the problem. The thing is, as we discussed it in the previous lectures too, things keep changing. You might find that people are pretty short-sighted when it comes to changing their positions. So that happens a lot. One day they would say something about a certain party, for example, then the other day they might change their opinion and come up against it. So you never know, as I just gave an example. So anyway, I was just talking about this qualitative method. Field research survey is one of them, and you tend to see a lot of them in research and in the news too. The research principles are based on philosophical grounds and an ever-growing effort at making the research methods plus data more transparent. Philosophical grounds, what exactly do we mean by philosophical grounds? That it's basically theoretical grounds. It's a philosophy behind it. If you carry out a research, if you want to go ahead with, suppose, a survey or an interview or an on-spot survey, anything like that, there is a thinking behind it. You want to do something on some certain grounds. For example, if I just talked about the prospects of one of the challengers in US presidential election, and why was it important? What was the philosophy behind carrying out such a survey? Well, basically the philosophy was that there are a lot of people interested in knowing who would next be the president or the prime minister in our country, in our country's case. So you can see, you can imagine interest groups. You can imagine different groups that are interested in knowing who would be the next president or the prime minister, because they want certain interests of theirs to be pursued by them. We talked about the group theory and stuff like that. So this is just an example. A lot of people might be interested in knowing that. So what the research survey gives you is a picture, an interpretation that this is probably what is going to happen. So there's a philosophy behind it. People have their own motives of carrying out survey. Organizations, what they are is exactly not clear, but there is something behind it. There is some thinking behind it of carrying out these kind of qualitative research methodologies. And another thing is that making the data more transparent. Making the data more transparent, it's applicable in our case, in the cases where countries, you would put them in the category of developing nations like ours. What happens a lot of the time, and I think I also discussed it in one of the previous lectures too, that a lot of the data is doctored data. It's not transparent data. But when people find out, when the donor agencies find out, they are furious with it, and they say, why do you do this thing? What is the reason for that? As I said, governments have their own reason. They want themselves, or they want their performance to look good, and that is why they try to doctor around numbers and try to make it look good. But ultimately they are found out on that. There are pretty smart people out there who can find out these things, and it's embarrassing for them. Unfortunately, people over here, especially, they don't learn and continue on with the stuff. But if you are carrying out a qualitative research, then it is imperative that you come up with data that is transparent. It is not biased, it is not influenced. It is your own effort, and it is transparent. The researcher hasn't doctored it, the researcher hasn't changed the original data. That goes towards making a good qualitative survey. Otherwise, it's not. The term came into formal use in the 1960s when there arose a need to distinguish between the new, advanced statistical methods developed for performing complex operations on data. The qualitative research emerged as a field that primarily dealt with data gathering in one of the three ways: observing, interviewing, and reading on topic related material. So this distinction, this need for distinguishing between those complex computational models, statistical or mathematical, that were gradually taking over many fields. In fact, studies in many fields. There was a need to distinguish between those methods and the ones that were not in that category. And mind you, there was another fact too of naming this stuff as qualitative research methods. There was another need, and the need was that in the face of these increasingly complex statistical and mathematical models, there was a real question that do we need these surveys and that kind of stuff, interviews. There is some people were of the opinion that there is no need for it, but the people who then separated this field as and named it as qualitative research, they said that there is need for it, and we need to distinguish between that and this one. So it was in the 1960s, primarily in the US, when this distinction became apparent, and since then this has stuck on. There are two broad categories: one is quantitative and the other one is qualitative, which we are now just going through. There is this gradual movement towards more computer-aided methods rather than simple ones, in order to gain the kind of legitimacy that quantitative methods have. For example, all the data gathered is now analyzed through advanced computer-aided designs and programs. Now remember this stuff, that what I'm trying to get to you over here is that it's not about going towards the same methods or same kind of complex methodology that is in quantitative, that is a hallmark of quantitative research. What you are basically doing over here is that, look, if you have gathered a lot of data, and in some instances this is indeed a lot of data. For example, if there has to be a nationwide survey, then just in Pakistan there are around 185 million people estimated. So gathering data and trying to analyze data of 185 million people just on a piece of paper, that would be rather difficult, if not impossible. I'm sure you would agree. That's a lot of data, tons and tons of data. So what these computer programs that are used in qualitative research do is that they don't run statistical tests like in quantitative research, but what they do is that they try to filter out the data. It works according to what we require. You would have seen this if you have worked on Excel, that there is this function in Excel which we know as filter. So what it does is that if suppose I require data from a certain period of time, suppose only 5 years, or from a certain district, or from a certain locality, or even from a certain province, then I can easily apply a filter, and that filters out the data and gives me my required data instead of all of it. So that Excel format with the filter, that's kind of qualitative research. It's qualitative, it's not quantitative, because it's not running any test of work or of quantitative methods. So hopefully you would have done that too, and you would have experienced it too. जो quantitative methods होते हैं उनमें जो computerized जो programs हैं, मिसाल मैंने आपको दी Microsoft Excel की, उसका मकसद ये नहीं होता कि जिस तरह क्वांटिटेटिव मेथड्स हैं, इकोनोमेट्रिक्स वगैरह है, कि उसमें बड़ी कम्प्लेक्स किस्म की, बड़ी मुश्किल किस्म की जो वो स्टेटिस्टिकल टेक्निक्स हैं उन पे टेस्ट रन किए जाए. नहीं, इनका मकसद ये होता है कि कभी बहुत दफ़ा ये होता है कि इनफैक्ट अक्सर औकात ये होता है कि जो रिसर्चर होता है उसको किसी वक्त में सिर्फ एक मखसूस किस्म के डेटा की ज़रूरत होगी. मिसाल के तौर पे अगर मैं रिसर्चर हूँ, मुझसे ये कोई पूछे, मेरे पास पूरे पाकिस्तान का डेटा पड़ा हुआ है, ठीक है, जो कि 18 करोड़ लोगों से ज़्यादा है और बढ़ते ही जा रहे हैं, कमी की कोई वो नहीं नज़र आती. लेकिन एनीवे, अगर मेरे पास 18 करोड़ लोगों का डेटा है, लेकिन मुझसे कोई ये आगे पूछता है कि इसमें से मुझे सिर्फ एक डिस्ट्रिक्ट का या एक सूबे का या एक ख़ास जगह है उसका डेटा चाहिए. मिसाल के तौर पे वहाँ पे आबादी कितनी है, उसमें बूढ़े लोग कितने हैं, जवान लोग कितने हैं, उसमें बच्चे कितने हैं. तो ये चीज़ें जो हैं, अगर मेरे पास सिर्फ वो कागज़ ही पड़े हों, सर्वे ही पड़े हों, उधर से उनको उठा के उसमें से देखना, उसमें से ढूंढना, ये काफ़ी इसमें वक्त लगता है. इट्स टाइम कंज्यूमिंग. सो आसानी के लिए ये किया जाता है कि मसलन माइक्रोसॉफ्ट एक्सेल है, उसमें एक फंक्शन है आप लोगों ने, जिसने भी माइक्रोसॉफ्ट एक्सेल में काम किया हुआ है ज़रूर देखा होगा, कि उसे कहते हैं फिल्टर. फिल्टर ये करते हैं कि फिल्टर आपने लगा दिया, उस फंक्शन को ऑपरेट किया, तो उसमें फिर आपने कोई वैल्यू डाल दी कि जी सपोज मुझे एक डिस्ट्रिक्ट है, उसको डिस्ट्रिक्ट उसमें फ़िल्टर में आ जाता है कि जी किस डिस्ट्रिक्ट का आपको चाहिए, वो खुद ही बता देता है उसमें जितना भी डेटा होता है. तो उसमें वो आप सेलेक्ट करेंगे तो आपको सिर्फ उस डिस्ट्रिक्ट का डेटा दे देगा. तो ये क्वालिटेटिव जो मेथड्स हैं, मिसाल के तौर पे सर्वे हो गए या इस तरह की और इंटरव्यूज़ वगैरह हो गए, ये इसमें अगर कंप्यूटर प्रोग्राम्स यूज़ किए जाते हैं वो अपनी आसानी के लिए यूज़ किए जाते हैं, वो टेस्ट रन करने के लिए यूज़ नहीं किए जाते. उनका इस्तेमाल टेस्ट के लिए नहीं होता, उनका इस्तेमाल होता है सिर्फ अपनी आसानी के लिए कि किसी वक्त में किसी भी शख्स को कोई मखसूस किस्म का डेटा अगर चाहिए होता है, तो बजाय इसके कि वो सारे वो जो बंडल पड़े होते हैं कागज़ों के, उसमें जाने की बजाय, उनसे कंसल्ट करने की बजाय, और जल्दी से ख़ुद उठा के उनको एक्सेल प्रोग्राम उसमें अगर डेटा होता है तो फिल्टर लगा के उससे जल्दी से चेक कर लेता है. सो इट मेक्स इट ईजियर फॉर अस. दैट इज़ व्हाट कंप्यूटर एडेड प्रोग्राम्स and qualitative research too. Now, instead of being grounded in statistical lingo, the research report of interpretive methodology reads more like novels. Most of the research papers or research that we will go through in this course is of qualitative or interpretive variety. अच्छा देखिए, अभी जो अभी तक हमने इस कोर्स में जितनी भी रिपोर्ट्स पढ़ी हैं और इवन जो पॉडकास्ट आप लोगों ने सुनी है, आपने देखा होगा कि उसमें कोई हम किसी टेस्ट का जिक्र नहीं करते, या ये नहीं कहते कि हमने इसमें ये इस किस्म का एक एनोवा टेस्ट रन किया है या रिग्रेशन एनालिसिस रन किया है और उसमें हमारे पास ये वैल्यूज़ आई हैं. नहीं, इसमें जो इसकी एक डिस्टिंक्शन है वो ये है कि रिसर्च रिपोर्ट्स रीड लाइक नॉवेल्स. नॉवल जब आप पढ़ते हैं तो वो एक फ्लो में जा रहा होता है, उसमें कोई कम्प्लेक्सिटी नहीं होती, उसमें एक आसानी होती है, चल रहा होता है एक फ्लो में. इसी तरह रिसर्च रिपोर्ट्स भी जो होती हैं वो एक फ्लो में जा रही होती हैं. अभी जो हम लोगों ने इनमें से ज़्यादातर रिसर्च रिपोर्ट्स पढ़ी हैं या अखबार की रिपोर्ट्स पढ़ी हैं, वो आपने देखा होगा कि वो एक फ्लो में जा रही होती हैं, रिसर्च रिपोर्ट्स नावल की तरह. और जो हम पढ़ेंगे भी कुछ रिसर्च रिपोर्ट्स, वो भी नावल की तरह ही होती हैं. तो this is one distinguishing feature, that they are easy to read, they can be accessed by anybody. But in contrast, if you put those papers, quantitative research method papers, to somebody and tell them that, look, I have run this test which is part of this ANOVA, and I have tested for 2 means, the difference is For a person who doesn't have grounding in statistics, or who doesn't understand what it is, he'd be looking at you and saying that what the hell are you talking about? So this is a kind of a distinction. I'm sure if you go on to become a public policy analyst, which I hope quite a few of you will do, you'd be, if you are in the qualitative field, you'd be writing quite a bit of these kinds of reports. So if you are writing them, try to be as clear and as simple as possible so that the layman can read them too. Some major qualitative methods of interpreting data are as follows. अब ये qualitative methods के major जो हैं categories, वो उनको अब हम डिस्कस करते हैं. जिस तरह हमने डिस्कस किए थे एनोवा और रिग्रेशन एनालिसिस और ये और वो, तो इसमें भी कुछ जो कैटेगरीज आती हैं. लेट्स गो थ्रू देम. फर्स्ट वन इज ऑब्जर्विंग. दो इट साउंड सिंपल बट इन रियलिटी इट मे नॉट बी. ऑब्जर्वेशन में साउंड सिंपल कि जी बस ऑब्जर्व ही कर रहे हैं ना, हमने एक देखनी है एक चीज़, बैठे हुए हैं देख रहे हैं, या कोई इधर ऑब्जर्व कर लिया एक चीज़ को, तो इसमें क्या मुश्किल बात है. ये इतना आसान नहीं होता सिर्फ ऑब्जर्वेशन के जी बस ऑब्जर्वेशन कर ली. दिस मेथड इज क्लोजली ग्राउंडेड इन पार्टिसिपेंट ऑब्जर्वर एंड एथनोग्राफिक रिसर्च. ये दो रिसर्च विल डिस्कस इट इन डिटेल later on. Ethnographic implies a concentration upon the actors being studied and their intended motivation action. अच्छा अब देखें, अभी मैंने बात की कि ये इतनी सिंपल बात नहीं है. अब एथनोग्राफिक की हमने बात की कि वो बेसिकली जो लोग हैं जिनको हम ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं, ये उनके बारे में है, उनकी मोटिवेशन के बारे में, उनके एक्शन के बारे में, वो क्या करते हैं. अब वो जो क्या करते हैं उसके पीछे भी पूरी एक कहानी होती है. अक्सर आप लोगों ने देखा होगा कि सियासतदान जो बात करते हैं वो असल में उनका मकसद कुछ और होता है. बहुत से इवन एनालिस्ट जो होते हैं जो बात करना चाहते हैं वो उसको घुमा फिरा के बात करते हैं. तो सिर्फ ऑब्जर्व करने से, अब अगर मैं बैठा हूँ और टीवी शो ऑब्जर्व कर रहा हूँ, टीवी शो में अक्सर ये मुज़ाकरे चल रहे होते हैं, इनकी भरमार है आजकल, और कोई मेरे ख्याल में टीवी वालों के पास वो ज़्यादातर यही है. तो वो मुज़ाकरे जो चल रहे होते हैं, मुख्तलिफ जमातों के लोग आए होते हैं, वो आपने देखा होगा कि उनका मौक़िफ़ जो है वो कोई और अपने आप को, वो अपने कोई गलत काम भी किया हो उनकी जमात ने सपोज, तो वो उस चीज़ को जस्टिफाई करने की कोशिश करे, नहीं जी इस तरह नहीं हुआ, इस तरह हुआ है. लेकिन यू एज एन ऑब्जर्वर, आपने पढ़ा है, आपने उसको देखा है, आपको ये पता लग जाएगा कि मोटिव कुछ और है. सिर्फ मैंने जो चीज़ ऑब्जर्व की है ये कुछ और कह रहा है, तो कुछ ना कुछ जो है वो डिफरेंट है. सो इट्स नॉट जस्ट अबाउट सिंपल ऑब्जर्वेशन और व्हाट आई सॉ और व्हाट आई हर्ड. उसके पीछे पूरी एक जो कहानी होती है उसकी इंटरप्रिटेशन करने की ज़रूरत है कि मकसद असल में क्या. सो वन ऑफ देम इज एथनोग्राफिक, पार्ट ऑफ द ऑब्जर्विंग कैटेगरी. व्हाट द रिसर्चर tries to understand by observation and its interpretation is the unwritten rules and methods employed in day-to-day going about his or her business. अच्छा, जिस बंदे को, जैसा कि अभी हमने बात की, it's the same stuff, कि जिस बंदे को ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं या जिन लोगों को हम ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं, किसी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं, उसकी वर्किंग, या किसी हुकूमत को ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं, तो मकसद ये होता है कि वो इंटरप्रिटेशन की जाए, उस चीज़ को ज़रा जाहिर किया जाए, उस चीज़ को समझने की कोशिश किया जाए कि जो चीज़ें वो लोग करते हैं, जो कि दोज आर अनरिटन रूल्स मोस्ट ऑफ देम, कि ये किसी किताब में नहीं लिखा होता. करप्शन किसी किताब में नहीं लिखी होती, ये करप्शन करनी है, किसी रूल में नहीं है, रेगुलेशन में नहीं है, तो लेकिन लोग करप्शन करते हैं. तो एज अ रिसर्चर इट्स द ड्यूटी ऑफ दैट रिसर्चर to understand, to interpret what they are doing and what the motivation is, what their motives are. It can be done through observing, but it's not that, as I said, it's not that simple. You'll have to come up with good grounds and good interpretation of what exactly have you observed and what as a researcher you think that your observation has come up with. The book, the textbook. The book, it gives an example of a researcher who spent time with a family in Mexico. She made the observation that a lot more people occupy the physical space in a certain house than in United States, where it was prohibited by law to allow so many people to share one room or one house. She observed that it is then discriminatory. ये उसकी observation थी. discriminatory to ask the Mexican immigrants to follow the law in the US since it causes them both in material terms and otherwise. So the Mexican families, they are quite like our families in the sense they tend to, those are combined family systems. They a lot more people tend to occupy physical space in one room or one house than what people in the United States are accustomed to. In the United States, there is this culture of owning a separate house. So at a certain age, at a certain time, children are not supposed to live. It's not the law, but it's the law only is about how many people can live in a certain house, but it doesn't tell you that you should be leaving your parents at a certain age. It doesn't say that, but it's a culture over there that at a certain age, at a certain time, children are supposed to have their own homes. People are supposed to have their own homes, their own home ownership, and not be living with their parents anymore or in combined family system. It is the culture over there. So what the observer in this case, she observed was, she spent time in Mexico, then in the United States, and she spent time over there and saw that a lot more people occupy physical space. But there was a reason behind it, or the reason was कि उनको ये चीज़ एक साथ रहने में जो है बचत थी. मैं एक सिंपल सी बात बता रहा हूँ, इसमें बहुत से और रीजंस भी हैं. कल्चर ज़ाहिर है एक है, लेकिन साथ रहने में उनकी बचत बहुत थी बजाय इसके कि अलग अलग घरों में रहते. लेकिन जब वही फैमिलीज मेक्सिको से इमिग्रेट करके यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स गई, तो वहाँ पे लॉ ये था कि एक घर में इतने से ज़्यादा लोग नहीं रह सकते, तो उनको फिर अलहदा से अपार्टमेंट्स लेने पड़े, अलहदा से घर लेने पड़े, जो कि उनके लिए काफ़ी एक्सपेंसिव था, जो कि उनके लिए काफ़ी महंगा था इन मटीरियल टर्म्स, कि उनको जो पैसे वो लोग बचा सकते थे एक साथ रहने से, वो नहीं बचा सके, वो उनके खर्च हो गए. So this was just an observation she made, and on basis of that observation she interpreted that it's not a good law as far as immigrants are concerned, because they tend to live in combined family systems and they are okay with it. It's the culture over here that people in United States don't live in a combined system, but that shouldn't be enforced upon the other people, because there is certain cost to it. And that was her observation. So she made an observation, and she then made an interpretation that the law in the United States related to immigrants and them occupying a certain physical space, that is discriminatory and that should be removed. That was her interpretation of her observation. Some researchers even take an undercover role, but of course this raises many ethical questions. Again, अगर आप लोगों में से कोई भी ये न्यूज़ वगैरह चैनल्स देखता है, कभी कभार मेरा भी इत्तेफाक होता है कि ये देखता हूँ कि रिपोर्टर्स अंडर कवर चले जाते हैं कि जी हम लोग क्राइम को एक्सपोज कर रहे हैं, हम लोग बुराइयों, माशरे में बुराइयों को एक्सपोज कर रहे हैं. बट दैट रेजेस मैनी एथिकल क्वेश्चंस. बुराई का स्टैंडर्ड क्या है, किसकी नज़र में क्या बुराई है, क्या नहीं है. दीज आर सम ऑफ द क्वेश्चंस दैट नीड टू बी कंसिडर्ड. बेसिकली इट्स एन एथिकल इशू. इंटरव्यूइंग, ये एक और कैटेगरी है. The interview directs the trajectory of the conversation and interested in making sense of experience of the person interviewed. Now, if you are an interviewer, this is important that you dictate how things will be going. आपने पहले से ही सवाल तैयार किए होते हैं और एक मखसूस तरीके से तैयार किए होते हैं कि पहले ये पूछूंगा तो इस तरह एक ट्रैजेक्टरी इसकी चलती होगी कि उसी सीरीज में कंटिन्यू करूंगा और फिर उस पॉइंट पे आगे पहुंचूंगा. So you need to, if you are an interviewer, you need to come up with those questions that are in a trajectory, that go in a line. It's not, they are not random. They are go in a line, there is specific purpose to it. Can itself be enough to be taken as evidence in certain situations? Certain situations, कुछ हालात ऐसे होते हैं, कुछ जगह ऐसी होती है कि जहाँ पे सिर्फ इंटरव्यू जो होता है वो भी शवाहिद के तौर पे काफ़ी माना जाता है, उसमें और फिर एविडेंस की ज़रूरत नहीं होती. The interviewer can take initiatives besides the typical interview in terms of observation or interviewing more related people to back up his or her position. Research through document reading needs a careful selection of documents that can be from anywhere and any time related to specific topic. We will read quite a few of them in this course, but one has to be careful because arriving at a certain conclusion requires meticulous study and attention to minute details. Only then can a researcher arrive at a certain conclusion which can later be used or tested through quantitative studies too. اب یہ کافی کامن ہے آج کل ایکیڈیمیا میں خاص طور پہ کہ کوئی بھی ریسرچ کر رہے ہیں کوالٹیٹیو، تو اس میں پھر وہ سائٹیشنز ہوتی ہیں کہ کہاں سے آپ نے یہ چیز اٹھائی ہے، کہاں سے آپ چیز یہ کوٹ کر رہے ہیں، وہ آپ کو وہ جو ریفرنس دینا پڑتا ہے اس چیز کا. لیکن ریفرنس میں بھی یہ دیکھنا پڑتا ہے کہ آپ نے جو اسٹڈیز کوٹ کی ہیں ایک ریسرچر نے، اس کی ویلیڈیٹی کیا ہے، آر دے ویلڈ، آر دے ناٹ ویلڈ، کیا مقصد کیا ہے ان کا، کیا ڈو دے میک سینس. If you are quoting them in the study, is it related to study, is it not? یہ چیز میں نے کافی نوٹ کی ڈیورنگ مائی ریسرچ. بہت سی دفعہ ایسا ہوا کہ اگر میں نے کوئی ریسرچ پیپر لکھا، کوئی ریسرچ میں نے کی، تو اس میں اگر میں نے 20 ذرائع جو ہیں وہ استعمال کرنے کی کوشش کی کہ اس میں کچھ نہ کچھ مجھے مل جائے گا ریسرچ پیپر کے بارے میں، تو اس میں پھر زیادہ تر اوقات ایسا ہوتا تھا کہ ان میں سے زیادہ سے زیادہ 10 یا 12 جو تھے وہ قابل استعمال تھے، وہ زیادہ مؤثر تھے. باقی 8-9 جو تھے ان کی کوئی ضرورت نہیں تھی، وہ I could just ignore them. تو آپ بھی if you become ریسرچر اور ریسرچ پیپرز لکھ رہے ہیں، صرف اکیڈیمیا کے لیے نہیں، سپوز آپ نیوز پیپرز کے لیے لکھ رہے ہیں، you would need good citations اور relevant citations. یہ نہیں کہ بس کہیں سے کوٹ کر دیا. ریلیونس کیا ہے اس کی، جس چیز کے بارے میں آپ ریسرچ کر رہے ہیں. اچھا ایگزامپل، گریگری کلارکس ریسرچ آن اکنامک ڈیولپمنٹ ان برٹن اوور دا سینچریز تھرو پیرش ریکارڈز اینڈ ہز انٹرپریٹیشن. اب یہ گریگری کلارک ایک اکانومسٹ ہے، اس نے ایک ریسرچ کی تھی جو کہ جسے آپ کہتے ہیں نا کہ ایک دھماکہ خیز قسم کی ریسرچ تھی. دھماکہ خیز قسم کی اس لیے تھی کہ اس نے جو برتھ ریکارڈز ہیں، یعنی پیدائش کے جو ریکارڈز ہیں، وہ 2-3 صدیوں کے اٹھائے اور اس سے ایک انٹرپریٹیشن یہ کرنے کی کوشش کی کہ برطانیہ میں جو جتنی ترقی ہوئی اس میں کیا اس میں ان چیزوں کا کوئی کردار ہے، اس سے اس نے ایک انٹرپریٹیشن کرنے کی کوشش کی. اب آپ یہ سمجھ سکتے ہیں، ٹرائی ٹو انڈرسٹینڈ اینڈ ٹرائی ٹو کمپریہینڈ ہاؤ امپورٹنٹ دس از. یہ کتنے اہمیت والی بات ہے. اکنامک ڈیولپمنٹ جو ہے، دس از دا ہولی گریل. اکنامک ڈیولپمنٹ از دا ہولی گریل، اکنامک گروتھ از دا ہولی گریل آف اکنامکس، اینڈ اٹس آل اباؤٹ اکانومیز ناؤ ڈیز. سو ٹرائنگ ٹو انڈرسٹینڈ what aided the economic development or what brought about economic growth or economic development in a country is historically is very, very important. It has quite a lot of implications. For example, technology is one of the most important determinants of productivity, and productivity, you don't need to go into the details of the stuff. I'm just making a brief statement of it in trying to make you understand. So productivity is an important part of economic growth. Higher the productivity, higher the economic growth. That's at least what the relation between these two is. So the causality runs from productivity to economic growth. So what Gregory Clark came up with, it's kind of a genetic interpretation, a behavioral interpretation of economic development in Britain over the centuries. What he did was that he took out all those records. They have very good records going back to centuries, which is astonishing considering that in Pakistan you'd be hard pressed to find evidence for the last 10 years, and most of it, if it is government statistics, then you could be sure that there would be some doctoring in it, there would be some changes in it. So anyway, but they have got meticulous records in Britain. They have preserved it very well. So Gregory Clark, what he did was that he took out the records of births by family and tried to understand what happened to generations over time. What he did was that he came up with this observation that over time in Britain there was a downward social pressure, or in meaning that a lot of the poor people, they decreased over time because they didn't have many children. They stopped having many children at one time, as is very common. Poor people, poor families tend to have more children than the wealthy ones or the educated ones or the middle class ones, in fact. But Gregory Clark, to his astonishment, what he found was that over time in Britain, over centuries, the poor people gradually started declining in the population. So there was this this downward pressure on population, and they tended to have lesser children. The more children were associated with the middle class and the wealthy ones, especially the middle class. And middle class, Gregory Clark mentioned that they had these positive attributes, positive qualities like thrift, hard work, productivity, investment, savings, innovative thinking, creativity. That is why when they started to increase in numbers, and they had these behavioral traits over centuries, over time, that were being transferred from their parents to their children, all these good traits that I just mentioned, that helped a lot in economic growth in Britain. Now, suffice to say that it was quite controversial too, this study, but one thing was clear, that the records were foolproof. He had all those records, he had them in his database, and he challenged anybody to come up with a proof that there is something wrong with the records. Nobody did, nobody denied, nobody could deny that the record was perfect, that it was right and there was no doctoring in it, it was good enough. Problem was with his interpretation, but Gregory Clark, that was Gregory Clark's interpretation, behavioral mode or genetic touch to the development or economic growth debate. A lot of people had problems with that, but what I'm trying to say is that nobody could deny the data. There was difference in interpretation. Based on his observation, based on his research of the parish records of births, and who the child belonged to, which family did the child belong to, was it middle class, wealthy or poor family, he came up with his interpretation that is by now pretty famous. Even Gregory Clark is pretty famous now, although a lot of people still have problems in accepting that interpretation. But this is an example of how you come up with a major study, some major data, and then try to make a very good interpretation of it. I like his interpretation. A lot of people do, but a lot of people don't. But this is just an example of how you collect data and then make an interpretation. Once the researcher has data in hand, there are quite a few methods for analyzing that data. The following few are used most frequently in policy research questions. Once you have data in hand, there are then a few methods which you can use to analyze that data, and a few of them, just like as we did in quantitative methods, as we studied in quantitative methods, that you just cannot run test under regression analysis, then test it under ANOVA or any real-time series, the long-term series. You need to be certain of what you want to do, because different tests are meant for different things. What do you want to do? Do you want to run a test for 40 years? Then you'd be time series analysis is best for that. Do you just want to run a causal relationship? Then regression analysis is good for that. So you need to know what you want to do. So once you have the data in hand, you need to know what you want to do with this data now. And so there are a few methods of analyzing that in terms of policy research question. First one, frame or value critical analysis. Critically analyzes the data from the perspective of all the sides in terms of arriving at a mutually understandable position. Storytelling analysis involves an interaction with frontline workers on public policies and their narration of events. It's their side of the story and their interactions with other actors during the time that is of interest to the investigator. Now, this is, as the name would suggest, it's storytelling. You have to weave a narrative. You have to come up with a story. You have to listen to the story of the others, those who are at the forefront, those who are there in the project, who are working there, who have experienced it. Not just the project, but suppose you are experiencing, so you are doing research on some social phenomenon like crime, then you would, as a good researcher, you should be able to get the perspective of those criminals who have been caught, and because they are at the front line, they are doing this. So get them to talk, get them to tell their story, what it was about. You have the data of how many criminals and what category of criminal record does the accused have. You can categorize that. You have the data now. So now it's time to listen to their story. What do they have to say? Suppose an important question is for policymakers, at least in the industrialized world. I don't know about here, but they have this certain perception that it is very important to understand why a person committed a crime, how he turned. Nobody's born a criminal. It's the society, it's the circumstances which make a criminal out of a person, and the culture too. But so they are pretty interested in knowing why a person who is already a criminal, and they want to know their story. Why did he or she become a criminal? What was it? What were the circumstances? And in telling that story, you would be learning his side, his or her side, and you'd be learning about other characters too in the story who are more relevant. Some are less relevant, some are more relevant, but in that story you'd find a lot of information. So then you have the data, you have the story, you can now write a good research paper based on that data and that story, and make an interpretation that sometimes would contradict the data or the observation, or sometimes would conform to it. So it can go both ways, but that is how storytelling analysis works. Narrative analysis, very similar to story analysis, but for the difference that the storyline is not general, but for the concentration on developing a specific narrative. Okay, so it's almost the same as storytelling, but it's not general. You wouldn't be asking I gave the example of a criminal. You wouldn't be asking the criminal to tell whole of the story. You would be just asking him or her to tell a specific part of the story. Suppose you would be, for example, you might ask the criminal about activities in a certain area rather than in general, and what he or she has been doing in all over the country or all through their lives. You would be just asking them that, look, I just need information or your story or your narrative about this time and what you did in this time and this area. So that's narrative analysis. You just narrow it down to a specific objective or specific research question that you want to be answered. Dramaturgical analysis. This approach takes its cue from a literary tradition whereby plays, specifically their characters and their actions, are analyzed in detail in order to interpret any motive or design that may not be so visible through ordinary service. This is for those who have taken English classes or doing their masters in English. This is pretty easily understandable. There is a literary tradition of trying to interpret what the story is about, or what the novel is about. There is this whole field now that deals specifically with interpretation of the plays. What the drama writer, the script writer was trying to get at, what was his intention, what was his motive, was it this thing or the other thing. I'm sure you must have heard, all of you must have heard about Shakespeare. Shakespeare is pretty famous. Most of the English plays in England, the most famous ones were written by Shakespeare a few centuries ago, and till now they are being interpreted according to the views of the researcher. What they do is they read all of the script, they read all the characters, their motives, their actions, then try to interpret what Shakespeare was trying to get at. Why did he write the play? Why did he introduce these characters? What was the meaning of a specific line that he wrote in the plays? These kind of things, they are part of interpretation. It's a literary tradition. In fact, I've heard that in England they have now a whole department specifically devoted to Shakespearean studies, all his plays that he has written and their interpretation, and they have a degree in Shakespeare studies. So there you go, that's a tradition, that's an incentive to study literature. There's a whole narrative about it now, there's a whole department about it now. Just one writer, a famous one, and his plays have now resulted in an attempt at interpretation of the plays has now resulted in a whole new department where interpretations about his plays keep coming by researchers and from their point of view. So the next one, the above were some of the main categories and subcategories of qualitative research. One thing is clear, it is not as easy as people think. Making well-informed interpretation is no child's game. And then making it in perspective of policy making and analysis is very demanding. मैंने पहले भी इस चीज़ का जिक्र किया था कि पॉलिसी मेकिंग जो है ये पूरा एक आर्ट है, ये पूरी एक साइंस है. ये इतना आसान नहीं है कि मैंने एक चीज़ बस देख ली और मेरे ख्याल में इसका नतीजा ये निकलना है. There are so many things in it. बहुत सी चीज़ें ऐसी होती हैं जो कि हम ऑब्जर्व कर सकते हैं, जिनका हम अंदाज़ा लगा सकते हैं, लेकिन बहुत सी चीज़ें ऐसी भी होती हैं जिनका हम अंदाज़ा नहीं लगा सकते. Those uncertain events. तो उसकी चीज़ पे ये कहना कि सिर्फ अपना एक ओपिनियन कायम कर लेना कि मैंने ये चीज़ देखी है, मेरे ख्याल में इस तरह होना है, इट इज़ डिफ़िकल्ट, इट्स नॉट नेसेसरी. परहैप्स यू माइट बी राइट. बहुत दफ़ा ऐसा होता है कि आई हैव सीन इट माई सेल्फ, बहुत दफ़ा ऐसा होता है कि जो एक्सपीरियंस किस्म के रिसर्चर्स होते हैं वो एक पहले से एक अच्छा इन्फॉर्म्ड गेस लगा लेते हैं कि कोई एक पब्लिक पॉलिसी है, उसके साथ होना क्या है, उसका आखिर में अंजाम क्या होना है, क्या वो कामयाब होगी, क्या वो कामयाब नहीं होगी, आखिर में उसका नतीजा क्या निकलना है. उनके पास एक इन्फॉर्म्ड गेस होता है. लेकिन बहुत सी दफ़ा ऐसा हुआ है कि मैंने बहुत एक्सपीरियंस रिसर्चर्स को भी देखा है कि उनके गेसेस गलत हो जाते हैं, वो जो अंदाजे लगाते हैं वो गलत हो जाते हैं, कोई ना कोई उसमें मसला निकल आता है, या तो बिल्कुल एग्जैक्ट वो नहीं होते, उसमें कोई ना कोई तब्दीली आ गई होती है. लेकिन ये इतना आसान काम नहीं है. जैसा कि अभी हमने देखा है, इसमें इंटरव्यू है, इसमें स्टोरी टेलिंग है, इसमें एक एनालिसिस है, फिर एक ऑब्जर्वेशन है कि एक मुशाहिदा है कि मैंने एक चीज़ के बारे में कोई मुशाहिदा किया, कोई ऑब्जर्वेशन की. अब उसकी बेसिस पे मैं एक अपना बहुत अच्छा ओपिनियन कायम कर लूँ कि बस ये मैंने मुशाहिदा किया तो ये कहने का मकसद ये है कि ये इतनी कोई आसान बात नहीं है. शायद रिसर्चर ठीक हो, जो रिसर्च कर रहा है उसकी बात ठीक हो, वो एक ऑब्जर्वेशन करता है ओवर टाइम, वो एक रिसर्च कर रहा है और उसके मुताबिक उसकी कोई ऑब्जर्वेशन है और उस ऑब्जर्वेशन से वो एक इंटरप्रिटेशन निकालता है, एक मतलब निकालता है कि जी ये मेरे ख्याल में इसके साथ ये होना है. लेकिन अब वो उसका ख्याल है, ये एक इन्फॉर्म्ड गेस है. इट्स नॉट ईजी. ये काफ़ी जब पब्लिक पॉलिसी पे आता है तो उसमें बहुत सी चीज़ें होती हैं, उसमें बहुत से ऐसे कैरेक्टर्स हैं, बहुत से इवेंट्स हैं, बहुत सी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस हैं जिनके मोटिव्स के बारे में हमें कोई पता नहीं है कि वो क्या करना चाहते हैं इसके साथ. पब्लिक पॉलिसी जब उनके पास आती है तो फिर उसमें से बहुत से ऐसे भी हैं, मैंने जो देखा है हुकूमत के साथ काम करके, वो ये भी है कि बहुत से डिपार्टमेंट्स होते हैं उसमें से अपना मतलब निकालने की कोशिश करते हैं, उसमें से अपना वो कहते हैं ना उल्लू सीधा करने की कोशिश करते हैं. तो और ये चीज़ें ज़ाहिर नहीं होती, ये छुपी हुई होती हैं, उसकी एक इंटरप्रिटेशन करनी पड़ती है, उसको ऑब्जर्व करना पड़ता है बाकायदा, तभी उसका कोई ना कोई नतीजा निकलता है. Separation of methods by nature. We talked about categories. This is by nature. the nature of what we are discussing or the nature of the research, what it is for. So that's a separation of the qualitative methods by nature. Since qualitative methodologies primarily rest on the basis that the reality around a product is of social constructs. It tries to uncover that reality through changes in social practices. The following general methodological techniques and sampling methods are used. So a lot of it is goes to social constructs. You must have heard that about man being a social animal, that you just cannot quit the world and sit on a side and say that, look, I'm done, I don't need anybody. It doesn't happen. Even the most individualistic of the person would need somebody, needs to have interaction with somebody to go about the business of life. So qualitative methodologies, they rest on the basis that whatever there is observation, whatever happens, there is a social basis to it. There is a social narrative or social construct to it, which we should keep in observation. The researcher should keep in perspective. The first one, I think studied it before, just discussed it in the ethnography, refers to an in-depth study of individuals or group in their own cultural context, not outside of it, in their own cultural context. It implies the researcher becoming a part of the culture in order to observe and investigate. There are certain prerequisite rules like gaining an entry to avoiding forming preformed conceptions. In this kind of technique, when you're doing this kind of qualitative ethnographical surveys, you need to become a part of what you are studying. So if it is about a group, you need to become a part of the group, or at least make them feel that you are a part of them to carry out a good survey. Action research mainly geared towards a critical analysis of a problem and coming up with solutions or strategies at addressing the issue. For example, policy advice in the education sector reforms goes to a critical observation of current practices. Critical analysis होता है जी एक किसी प्रॉब्लम का, कि you cast a critical eye on it. क्या इसमें कमी थी, क्या इसमें कमी पेशी थी, किस साइड से ये लैग करता था. ये एक्शन रिसर्च है. क्या ये फाइनेंशियल साइड से इसमें कोई कमी थी, क्या इसमें एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव साइड से कोई कमी थी, ह्यूमन रिसोर्स साइड से कोई कमी थी, क्या कमी थी. ये एक्शन रिसर्च का पार्ट है. क्वालिटेटिव रिसर्च में एक्शन रिसर्च का. फॉर एग्जांपल, पॉलिसी एडवाइस इन द एजुकेशन सेक्टर रिफॉर्म्स owes to a critical observation of current practices. अभी हम इसकी एक मिसाल भी पढ़ेंगे, अभी बहुत ही रिसेंट मिसाल है एजुकेशन सेक्टर की, नेक्स्ट लेक्चर में होगी प्रॉब्ली, कि इस तरह की जो एक्शन रिसर्च होती है वो एक पॉलिसी जो ऑलरेडी चल रही है, पॉलिसी जो ऑलरेडी है, उसका एक क्रिटिकल एनालिसिस होता है. उसको देखता है वो रिसर्च करने वाला है कि कहाँ पे इस निज़ाम में या इस पॉलिसी में कहाँ कमजोरियाँ हैं और इसको किस तरह इम्प्रूव किया जा सकता है. दैट इज़ पार्ट ऑफ द एक्शन रिसर्च. अब मैंने एजुकेशन सेक्टर की दी, उसमें ज़्यादातर एजुकेशन सेक्टर में जो रिसर्च हो रही है ना जी, वो क्वांटिटेटिव नहीं है, वो क्वालिटेटिव है. अगेन देखें, अब आप कैटेगरी देखें जहाँ पे इकोनॉमिक्स की रिसर्च होती है, इकोनॉमी के बारे में रिसर्च होती है, वो ज़्यादातर होती है क्वांटिटेटिव. उसमें यही रिग्रेशन एनालिसिस हो गया, टाइम सीरीज एनालिसिस हो गया, ये चीज़ यूज़ होती है. मिसाल मैंने आपको दी थी एक रिग्रेशन एनालिसिस की, कि वो एक एस्टिमेट करने की कोशिश करते हैं कि अगर इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ इतनी ज़्यादा होगी तो फिर उसका स्टॉक मार्केट पे क्या असर होगा. अब एजुकेशन का फील्ड है, तालीम की जो फील्ड है, उसमें इस किस्म के जो रिसर्च है आपको कम ही मिलेगी. उसमें ज़्यादातर रिसर्च होगी क्वालिटेटिव, कि कहीं सर्वे कर लिया, कहीं चलेगा रिसर्चर एक गांव में चला गया, उसने वहाँ पे ये ऑब्जर्व करने कुछ टाइम गुजारा, उसने देखा कि ये जो पॉलिसी है सूबाई लेवल पे या वफाकी लेवल पे या लोकल लेवल पे, यूनियन काउंसिल लेवल पे, उस स्कूल के बारे में, उस एजुकेशन सिस्टम के बारे में, उसमें क्या खामियां है, क्या उसका कोई नतीजा अच्छा आ रहा है, अगर नहीं आ रहा तो क्या खामियां है, कहाँ से खामियां है. तो ये जो होते हैं पार्ट ऑफ क्वालिटेटिव रिसर्च है. केस स्टडी मोर अलोंग द academic studies that are conducted with multiple sources of data in order to arrive at a certain conclusion about the opinions formed before. یہ ابھی اس سے پہلے بھی ہم نے کیٹیگری پڑھی ہے جو ساری ریسرچ پہ بیس کرتی ہے. اب اس میں اگین زیادہ اہم چیز یہ ہے کہ جو آپ سورسز یوز کر رہے ہیں جو ایز اے ریسرچر, کہ اگر میں کوئی ریسرچر ہوں, میں سورسز استعمال کر رہا ہوں, کہیں سے ایک انفارمیشن میں دیکھ رہا ہوں کہ جی یہ میں اپنی اس کے لیے استعمال کرنا چاہتا ہوں ریسرچ کے لیے, اس کو سائٹ کرتا ہوں, تو اس میں بہت ضروری یہ ہے کہ جو میں ریسرچ سائٹ کر رہا ہوں اس کو وہ اس سے ریلیٹڈ ہو, اس کی کوئی ریلیونس ہو, مطلب یہ ہے کہ وہ ضروری ہو اس ریسرچ پیپر کے لیے, یہ نہیں کہ غیر اہم ہو اس ریسرچ کے لیے. کیس اسٹڈیز بھی اسی طرح ہے, ہم نے ابھی بھی آگے جا کے ہم لوگ کافی کیس اسٹڈیز پڑھیں گے, تو یہ کیس اسٹڈیز جو ہے یہ ایکڈیمک اسٹڈیز ہوتی ہیں بیسیکلی. Grounded research. This theory works on the principle of constructing a theory through observation, gather data and forming a conclusion in a systematic way. Later on, the conclusion is open to modification in light of the changed circumstances or new evidence. This type of research involves various qualitative methods like simple observation, individual and group interviews, research through published materials. اب grounded research جو ہوتی ہے اس میں دوسری جو ریسرچ میتھڈالوجیز ہیں ان میں اور ان میں جو فرق ہے یا پھر ان کو ایک دوسرے سے کس طرح ممتاز کیا جاتا ہے, وہ طریقہ یہ ہے کہ اس میں ایک تھیوری بنانے کی ہم کوشش کرتے ہیں, ایک کنسپشن بنانے کی کوشش کرتے ہیں کہ یہ میری آبزرویشن ہے, یہ میرا مشاہدہ ہے, اور یہ میرے پاس اتنا ڈیٹا پڑا ہوا ہے. ان سب کو دیکھتے ہوئے, ان سب کو مد نظر رکھتے ہوئے ایک تھیوری بنانے کی کوشش کی جاتی ہے. کوئی کمپلیکس ماڈل نہیں ہے, ایک سمپل سے ماڈل بنانے کی کوشش کی جاتی ہے کہ شروعات یہ ہیں, اس کے درمیان میں یہ چیزیں ہیں اور آخر میں یہ ہے, اور وہ ایک کیٹیگری بنائی جاتی ہے کہ جی یہ شروع ہے, یہ درمیان میں اور یہ آخر میں. یہ نہیں کہ بس ادھر سے شروع ہوئے, اس میں یہ بھی ہے, اس میں یہ بھی ہے, اس میں یہ بھی ہے. طریقہ کار ہوتا ہے, ایک سسٹمک طریقہ کار ہوتا ہے ٹو گو اباؤٹ تھنگس. دیٹ از نون ایز گراؤنڈڈ ریسرچ. So that's it for this lecture. We've covered a lot of ground regarding qualitative research. In the last lecture we went through the quantitative research methodologies. Now we went through the qualitative research methodologies and what kind of categorization can we make by method or by nature. And besides that we went through one prominent example of how a lot of data gathered over time was interpreted by an economist, and who came up with a brilliant theory, and he is now pretty famous. So hopefully I'd see you next time around. Take care and have a nice time.